Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina. I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up is a not-for-profit organisation. Our purpose is to help fellow not-for-profits leverage the digital world to positively impact their communities. The digital world is expanding beyond IT, software, hardware, and digital marketing to new innovative service delivery and measuring social impact. Connecting Up believes that not-for-profits with the right tools and skills can and do achieve great things for their communities. We have a long history of affordable software, hardware, educational events, and group consulting. We partner with over 40 organisations to deliver high quality products and services specifically meeting the unique needs of the not-for-profit sector. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar Service to Services, How Microsoft Azure Can Modernise Your IT Infrastructure, which will be presented by Marcus Harvey and Fahim Mimon from InfoExchange. We'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues, please type it into the questions box on your webinar panel and I'll be able to assist you. If you have any questions during the session, please also type it into the questions box and Marcus and Fahim will answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording and slides will be sent to you shortly after the webinar ends. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you there is a short survey at the end of the webinar. We would appreciate it if you took a few minutes to provide us with some feedback. That's all from me for now. I'll pass it over to Marcus and Fahim to get things started. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tina. And look, we're really excited to be talking with you this morning. We've got a cozy group by the look of it, so don't be shy with your questions, particularly if you want to know something about how you or your organisation can make the most of Azure. We've seen scores of non-profits move their infrastructure into Azure and really get some valuable availability, cost reduction, and reliability improvements. So if there's something we can help you with, don't hesitate to ask. From our perspective, many non-profits have moved both to virtual servers within Azure and also Azure Active Directory services with Windows 10 and Intune as well as the add-on. And we're seeing that really reduce on-premise infrastructure and free up tech staff to be able to add greater value. From just picking up on what Tina said earlier about the housekeeping, please don't hesitate to type those questions in. The only other comment I wanted just to reiterate is pricing and specs within the Azure environment are subject to change at any time. So we've got pricing examples throughout today's webinar, but we've seen quite a few prices drop in recent times, which is always good news, but some of the other prices have increased slightly. So use what we've given you today as an indicative guide so you can get a sense as to what things cost compared to what you might be able to get for on-premise infrastructure, but don't treat it as exact. We'll introduce you to the pricing calculators and show you those details so you can check the pricing at your heart's content. So getting straight into it, and I'm going to start with the most important thing first, at least from a lot of the organizations and people that we work with, and that is Microsoft is kind enough to give non-profits in Australia a grant to be able to purchase Azure services, and that goes towards your purchase. So you can purchase up to 3,500, and we round order of magnitude, we think of that as $5,000 Australian, that you can sign up for, and you can start running up servers, and you can test and have a play with the environment at no cost, thanks to the Azure Grant. Now, the best way of doing this, because that's the best way of actually getting started and seeing whether or not Azure is for you, is to register your non-profit with Connecting Up or TechSoup if you're in New Zealand. You can then obtain your TechSoup token. That's available on the account page from the Connecting Up or TechSoup website. And with that token, you then visit the Eligibility Web Azure websites page and enter your token, set up your 365 trial if you haven't already, activate your Azure subscription, and go through the process to make sure that you've activated and registered that grant against your account settings by signing in with your tenant admin credentials. Through that process, just so you know, as we've mentioned on point 10, you will need to add credit card details during that sign-up process. The reason for that is that if you start going to town and really enjoy Azure, as we hope lots of people will, you will be charged if your usage goes over that $3,500 US cap, around 5,000 Australian. And what Microsoft's doing at the moment is it's an annual renewal process. So it's a process of revalidating that token, reapplying it into the Azure credit space, and that then allows you next year to have another 3.5, or if they choose a different number, whatever the credit that you get for Azure is. But we've seen organisations get more than $10,000 of credit available of free services within Azure over the last couple of years. So it's something well worth doing, even if you only decide to use it for a development and test environment. It gives you a nice playpen that's reliable and easy to access. So that's the first thing we just wanted to cover really quickly to make sure that those people that are interested in Azure can go through that process. Just once again, the TechSoup token's available on the account page, or contact TechSoup if you have any issues with that process. I do want to talk about, just from a big picture perspective, the different infrastructure types and the examples and what we're seeing organisations use. So if we were to come back sort of 3 or 4 years, most organisations we were working with largely ran their own infrastructure. They had packaged software on top of the data application, middleware, OS, virtualization, server storage and networking infrastructure. And many organisations also provided the physical hardware, switches, routing, power, and air conditioning needs of all their infrastructure. What we're seeing is organisations move across the different options through infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, and take more and more advantage of the different offerings so that they can focus their time and effort on what makes the biggest difference to their organisation. We're going to talk primarily today about infrastructure as a service. So that's the perfect example of that being Azure, other examples being AWS and Google Cloud, where Microsoft runs the virtualization, the servers, the storage and the networking. You manage the OS, you patch the OS, and you also run the data and the applications on top of that infrastructure. That gives you the advantage of the fact that you can scale the virtual machines up and down as your heart desires, and it can give you some really nice redundancy and availability options to give your organisation greater flexibility and ability to control their destiny into the future without having to invest a significant capital expense every 3, 4 or 5 years. We are also seeing organisations use a lot more Azure Domain Services, which really is a platform as a service allowing authentication. And we're also seeing some organisations move into Azure SQL, which is a really nice way of accessing those SQL services in an elastic mechanism that really changes the pricing model away from the old world and auto upgrades and patches for you. Most organizations we're working with are also using Office 365, which is really software as a service. Other examples of that being Salesforce Zero and Google Apps. But wherever you are, and to be honest, a lot of organizations we work with actually end up in a hybrid environment where they still run some things themselves. They may have some on-premise servers for speed, redundancy, or responsiveness. They may run some servers in Azure, particularly from the perspective of providing central access to information and ability to access it irrespective of location, particularly for your small sites. They may run Azure domain services to enable those staff out and about or working from home to connect in from anywhere. And they may also run Office 365 as software as a service to give organisations and staff access to what they need. So we're seeing a lot more organisations pick a best of breed and a hybrid model that allows them to select the elements that are most appropriate. Today, we're going to focus predominantly on Microsoft Azure and talk through those offerings and how you can get access to it and what you need to think about. But I did want to start with that broader picture so that you can understand that Azure is only one of the building blocks that you need to consider. I'm going to hand over to Fahim now. Fahim is a senior Microsoft engineer here at Info Exchange and has configured Azure both for scores of non-profits around Australia and New Zealand, as well as in his time prior to Info Exchange, large commercial organisations who are making the most of these services as well, albeit without those wonderful non-profit discounts and donations available from Microsoft. So, Fahim, are you happy to talk through what is Azure?
Sure. Thank you, Marcus. So, what is Azure? In general, I would say Microsoft Azure is like an ever-expanding set of cloud services. So it's like basically a cloud platform, computing cloud platform that helps your organization meet your business challenges. It has the freedom to build, manage, and deploy applications on massive global network using your favorite tools and frameworks. That's in a nutshell what Azure is, and if you can see on the screen as well, just kind of defines how Azure is classified. So in the previous slide, as Marcus explained about the different set of services, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and software as a service. So Azure mostly focuses on platform services and infrastructure services. So Azure can also be deployed as a hybrid environment, so you can have part of your services in Azure and part on premises as well, or you can take all the services up in Azure. It is quite a trusted platform. About 95% of the Fortune 500 businesses, they actually recommend Azure and they use Azure services. It's also built on a very good security principles and practices. And with that, I'll just explain a bit of what platform and infrastructure services would be like in Azure. So as a platform, you really don't have to look after your servers or necessarily the patching. It will be all managed by the Azure platform. So you can directly integrate your sort of application into the Azure application layer, and you don't have to worry about managing any of the patching of it or look into very refined security settings. It can all be managed through the portal very easily. With the infrastructure, you do have to manage a part of security and a part of obviously the configuration yourself. So the example would be like if you have to run a domain services, you will have to use a virtual machine to run your domain controller services on it, and then you will be partially responsible for patching the servers, configuring the network side of things, configuring your WAN links, can get a bit more technical when you use infrastructure as a service. But on the platform as a service, it becomes a little bit less technical because most of the settings are managed by the Azure platform from the Microsoft. And another one that's not mentioned here, which is also works very well with Azure, is Office 365, which is a software as a service. So with that, you practically don't have to manage any of the background tasks. It all is looked after by the Microsoft side of the things. So in general, that's what Azure is. So what can I do with Microsoft Azure? So Azure hosting, for instance, I mentioned previously that you can run domain controllers on it, file servers on it, remote desktop services on it, that's RDP services. And Azure also provides its own backup storage as well, so you can back up your infrastructure on Azure. It also provides disaster recovery. If you have, for instance, services running somewhere on your physical premises, you can use Azure as a disaster recovery platform as well, and you can also use it for your existing virtual machines or servers running in Azure. You can also use them as a disaster recovery, just in case if things go wrong on the how should I say, the your operating system layer, and you need to spin up another server. So those services can help you minimize the time and the impact caused by the issues with your existing servers. And it can also provide website hosting, and website hosting is also part of the platform as a service. So you don't necessarily have to spin up a VM or a server and then install the IIS or Apache to host that website. You can just use the services as a platform on the Azure. So Azure IIS virtual machines. So IIS is infrastructure as a service. So there are a lot of different VMs profiles available which can cater your needs. So from the highest scale to the lowest scale, it all have different configurations, right? The number of CPUs, how much memory it has, and also how many network connections it can have, how much IOPS it can have. IOPS are like the input-output processing of the machine, how much workload it can handle. So scale from I said 1 core 768 MB RAM, which you can probably run a Linux machine on it, because Linux are very lightweight, as Azure supports Linux as well. So it starts about $22 per month and can go up to 32 cores, 448 gig worth of RAM, which can cost a fortune, which is about $9,000. There's no minimum commitment to it. You can upgrade and downgrade your machine anytime. It does require a reboot because obviously the profiles on the back end needs to be applied, but again, that's the benefit of it, that it's done very instantly. As I previously said, both Windows and Linux OS are supported on Azure, and currently they keep adding new profiles to it for the needs of different users, developers. Someone might need, some VMs which have different IOPS handling, or some might need based on their memory optimization, some might need on their storage optimization. So different profiles can cater different needs. And user availability set is ensured to 99.9% uptime SLAs. Usually it's deployed within 45 minutes using Azure Portal, and you can also use PowerShell to deploy it, and there are several ARM templates which you can use to deploy a lot of platform services. Prices may be a little bit different depending on the regions. So US West is a bit cheaper. Australia can get a little bit more expensive. But again, I think there's a lot of requirements for a lot of organizations to have their data locally stored. So Azure has, I think, about 2-3 data centers in Australia. The mostly we use is the Australia Southeast to store all of our clients' data there, and it's quite secure. And obviously, it leaves your data on the Australian grounds. It doesn't go on the US or the Europe side. So the data is, under those boundaries and principles defined. And the price have fallen quite recently, about 29%, and you can get an A2 series about 0.288 per hour. So Azure calculates the price on as you use it, so it kind of calculates you by a second, but in generally, you can calculate it with the minute and hour. So when you deploy a machine in the portal, when you select all the configuration, it will give you the estimate that how much it's gonna cost you an hour. So given at the bottom is just the name of the profiles, they usually go like A, D, DV2, and they have a kind of meaning behind it. If you're interested, you can find it on the Azure website. It will give you much more details about these VM profiles and how they function and what their optimizations are. So Azure Virtual Networking. So when you use it as a infrastructure as a service, and when you deploy VMs, you also need to deploy the network as well for the machines to access the network. So Azure VMs normally run off IPv4 network. You can either have static or dynamic. It does differ a little bit when you have a traditional data center and how you define the IP addressing, and it's a little bit different because most of the settings you define it on the Azure portal, not on your VMs directly. So there's minor differences there. And you also need Azure gateways and supported routers on your site if you are planning to have a VPN established with the Azure platform. There's a link provided there which can give you more details about the VPN and the devices supported. You can also create network security groups in Azure to protect yourself from, how should I say, it's more of a security mechanism. So it kind of filters your connections based on your IPs, so you can have a bit of security. That the thing is that if you create a VM on Azure, you can also give it a public IP address, and giving a public IP address, it can expose you to the internet. So that's why you use those network security groups to provide IP filtering, so only you or someone else you allow can connect to the VMs, and not anybody else can try to attack it. You can also have load balancing and application firewalls options. So if you have a server farm running up there, you can use those load balancers. They are also a part of Azure. They are generic ones that Microsoft Azure provides. You can use those load balancers to balance your load among the servers. Following is a list of gateways that you can use for VPN, and given on your bandwidth requirements, you can select the gateway which is more suitable for your needs. So Azure Storage. Azure also provides a lot of options for storage as well. So basic for Azure VMs, database, web apps, and backups, you can have different options depending on the need. Again, the higher end storage costs more, and the lower storage tend to cost less. It also depends on what is the need and what the VM is used for. So something like a SQL server might require different sort of storages, and then you can select those different sort of storage to balance the cost. So you can select between standard and premium SSDs tiers depending on the performing needs. So premium SSD will provide better IOPS, input-output operations. Standard tend to have less performance, but again, it's cheaper. And you can also have the level of redundancy. You can have the local redundancy, which can make a copy of your VMs or your data across different Azure data centers. So in case if there is something gone wrong on the Azure platform side as well, you are able to have your data available on the same region, another data center. It kind of protects you, but again, there is a cost factor involved into it as well. And you can also have the geo-redundancy available, which can copy your data, replicate your data to a different global region. So in case if there's a problem, let's say in Australia, the entire region, you should still be able to access your data through the different region. Might require a minor configuration to get your data up and running, things like DNS configuration, or if you have some on-premises server that talk to Azure platform, they might require minor changes to make sure that they can connect to a different global Azure region. There's also encryption available, so you can use a lot of platform services on Azure which use encryption, and only the keys provided to the Azure tenant owners. So let's say if you lose your key, even Microsoft won't be able to decrypt the data for you. So at times it has a disclaimer when you use the encryption services that please take care of your keys, encryption keys, because if you lose them, you won't be able to recover your data. Basically, you can't decrypt it without the key. So that's a good security feature to have that not even Microsoft can do. So it kind of gives you the assurance that the data is safe and it's only accessible by the tenant owners. You can also use different services to store data like HTTPS or SMB, which is your file share. And it doesn't really have the NTFS permissions, but you can define your permissions through the SMB shares. Each Azure VM comes with a 127 gig OS disk size, which is standard, but again, there's a minor change made recently as well. Azure allows you to have a smaller base size disk. So let's say if you really need a very small Linux server, you can select a smaller size of the VM. So from 127, that might go to 30 gig. The benefit of this is it helps you with the backup and reduces the backup time and also reduces the backup cost. But 127 gig is mostly the standard. If you try to go in the Azure portal and try to create a Windows OS VM, the standard size will be 127 gig. Here's a general case study given how Azure environment interacts and the Office 365 environment interacts with your on-premises. So given the example here, we have two offices here. One is Melbourne, one is Sydney. They both have their Azure supported routers, and they have a site-to-site VPN established with the Azure Gateway. So the benefit with the Azure Gateway is that you don't need anything physical. You can just select what you need, and it will provision for you within half an hour to an hour time frame. And once you set up your on-site VPN gateways, they will automatically connect to your Azure site gateways, given the configuration matches. But the catch is that your site routers should be Azure supported, and Azure provides a list of what it supports, and it also provides the configuration. So when you create an Azure gateway, it will give you the options to select what your device is, what the series is, and it will give you the configuration which you can set up on your on-site Azure supported routers. And you can use the AD Connect to sync your data, all your Active Directory data to Azure directly. And in this example, there is a domain controller which is spin up in Azure. So all your Windows 10 laptop which are domain joined and the Windows 10 PC which are domain joined can easily communicate with the domain controller up in Azure. So there is basically no need for a physical domain controller on site. All the data will flow through your site-to-site VPN, and if you're using Exchange Online, which is part of the Office 365 service, or through public internet or SharePoint Online, your routers should be able to direct the WAN traffic towards your public cloud. So when you have the configuration generated from the Azure side of the things for your VPN gateway, it is smart enough to give you the routes, which routes are supposed to go to Azure and which routes are supposed to go to the public internet. So it will keep the data flowing very smoothly. Azure backup and recovery. So Azure backups are directly stored on the Azure platform itself, and Microsoft Azure provides a sort of a component in Azure. If you log into the Azure tenant, you will see the options of it. You can create your own sort of storage containers that allows you also to set the region where would you like to have the backup done in Azure. There is no sort of local agent required, because once you spin up a VM in Azure, the Azure platform can directly communicate with that VM because it sits on their platform. But let's say if you want to back up your on-premises VMs, you will require an agent. So that agent can also be downloaded from the Azure portal. So as you will go through setting up the backup process, it will give you the link to download the agent, because the agent is specific to each machine and it has its own encryption key. And again, those encryption keys needs to be stored properly, because if you lose them, you won't be able to perform a restore. So you need a bit of storage capacity free on your server to have the backup overhead. So in this sense, it's at least 5% capacity. And system state backup available through advanced settings, and you can also set up your system state backup if you only want to set up to bring your system state. So for instance, some machines which have a data which can be backed up separately, so you only need to bring the machine back up in case if there's a OS corruption or there's a hardware failure. So you can only do a system state backup as well, and then you can restore your backup, or if it doesn't require a backup, it can just come up with a system state backup. Azure can also replicate your Hyper-V servers. So if you have a Hyper-V environment running, you can use the Azure site recovery options to replicate those VMs in Azure. So if you want to move let's say your existing infrastructure that runs on a Hyper-V and you want to move it to Azure, Azure gives you this flexibility through the site recovery options. You can either use it to completely move your VMs up in Azure, or you can use Azure just as a disaster recovery. So in case if you have any issues, like your data center caught fire or there's a link failure, your WAN failures, you can spin up those machines in a very short amount of time in Azure and have your operations running. And once you have retained your connectivity back in your data center, you can bring back those changes back to your original machines in Hyper-V. Once you create these site recovery machines in Azure, let's say from your Hyper-V, Azure will give you the profiling options based on the VMs, and that actually matches the size of your VMs down in your organization or your data center. So it's quite flexible with that. So if you want to have certain memory or certain storage size, Azure will be able to match that up. And it only charges the failure of the VM. So once you spin up the VM and when it's started to compute, then the charges will incur. But again, if you're using the service as a disaster recovery, it only will charge you for the storage part of it. It will not charge you for the compute or the RAM, because it's currently not using those compute resources. It's only storing them for your disaster recovery. So it will only cost once you start using the VMs in Azure. Azure SQL. So Azure SQL is more like a platform as a service. I mean, you can run it as an infrastructure as a service, but again, then you need to have your VM running, and then you have to install all the tools you need for the SQL. The benefit of this is that you don't need a VM. It directly integrates with the Azure portal, so you can set it up in Azure environment to run as a SQL service. So it's a past replacement for SQL servers, either on premises on Azure VM. But if you run on Azure VM, it kind of becomes more of a infrastructure as a service. So Microsoft handles patching of the SQL servers and base operating systems. When you run it as a platform as a service, PaaS, you don't really worry about the servers. You only use the application layer of it, where you interact with the SQL services, and Microsoft will take care of all the patching and all those more refined security settings that you don't need to worry about. Obviously, you will need to worry about the settings from your end that who connects to the SQL database, and all those credentials and the information is securely stored and given to the right people. And it starts from $7 a month for 2 GB database size, and can go up to 4 terabytes, which can cost about $9,000 plus. And the availability is again 99.9% SLA or higher. You can change tiers without any downtime. If you require that, we don't need that much compute power, you can step it down, or if you need more, you can step it up. And applications must support connecting to the SQL SQL because the interface is a bit different, so that might get a bit technical. So might need to check with the vendors, or if you have developed an application, you might need to have those adequate frameworks or the commands that you use to connect present there, or the APIs. So you can talk to your vendor to find out about the support of Azure SQL PaaS service. Geo-replication and automatic backups are available and are included in some service plans. There are a number of service plans that they offer as well. You can manage those settings in your portal, or you can use your system's management tools to manage the SQL PaaS instance. So I believe you should be able to connect it with how you connect to your existing database using the SQL management tools. Azure also provides the AD domain services. So when we talk about AD services, the traditional concept is you have your own physical servers or your VM, they run the domain controller services, sites and services, you have your Active Directory. So Azure has the AD services, AD domain services, which is more like which is actually a PaaS service. Again, then you don't have to spin up those VMs or servers to install and patch. This is more like a identity management service. You can, I believe the Windows 10 and forward machines support this option. So you should be able to join your existing Windows 10 machine to the Azure AD domain services, the PaaS services, given then it is configured in Azure and the accounts are available for you to authenticate. So again, Microsoft handles the patching of the DCs and uptime because you don't necessarily see those DCs. They are on the back end side. You only connect with the Azure application portal side of the things. When you log into the portal, and if your existing machine is already joined to the Azure AD domain services, you should be able to see that machine. And then you can manage a lot of, management of the machines through the Intune. Because you don't have a traditional data center, so you don't really configure group policies. I mean, the domain controllers, you don't configure the group policies. So you can use the Intune as a replacement for those group policies. It might not be as granular, but it will do the job. So you can use the Azure AD username and password as your Azure AD identity. So when you log into your Windows 10 machine, you should be able to use that Microsoft Azure account, and then it should directly integrate with your Azure services. And also, if you have the Office 365 services, they will also work with if they are on the same tenant, they will also authenticate with the same username and password. So they all kind of work together. It's like a whole ecosystem. So user, password, group changes throughout the same interface as Office 365 accounts. You can log into the Azure portal. They have the Azure Active Directory, sort of a lightweight Active Directory identity management. You can change the passwords. You can assign user to groups. You can create groups. And they're all tied down to a single virtual network. You can have multiple domains in the same subscription as well through the different networks, but it does require a little bit of configuration and settings. Can get a little bit technical there. You can also have your domain join Azure VMs and desktop via VPN. So if you have on-site VPN as well, you can get your Azure machines down here to join that AD services. It also integrates with the AD multi-factor authentication, which is MFA. It's a good security feature to have. Once you have your Azure, it provides you a very basic MFA, but again, to use most of the benefits of the multi-factor authentication, it's a paid service. It uses different features like you can use to call you to verify your authentication or send you a passcode through an SMS. Just in case if your password gets compromised, your account gets compromised, the user won't be able to log in because they don't have your cell phone or your some sort of another form of identity like your secondary email where they might send the information to verify. So it saves your account from those attacks and getting compromised. So the service is start about $142.14 per month. So hosting your public website, again, if you compare it with the infrastructure as a service and a PaaS as a service and an infrastructure as a service, you will need to have your own server, you will need to manage it, you will need to install the IIS or Apache or Tomcat to run that website. The benefit you get with the PaaS service in Azure is you don't need to worry about any of that. You can just select the package that works best for you, depending on your need, and it should be up within a matter of minutes. So Azure Web Ads supports WordPress and many popular platforms, and WordPress can be used for a lot of different purposes. It has a very wide platform. So Azure hosting supports those multiple platforms, and it's actually very easy. You can go through a wizard and it will help you configure those platforms, or you can create a blank app and connect it with either FTP or Visual Studio or GitHub, as a lot of developers do. They would like to have their versioning of their source code and would like to develop how they go across, because they might want to come back to their old code to test it. So it works very well for the developers. It also supports .NET, PHP, Node.js, Python, Java, Classic ASP, or any fast CGI handlers. Development slots for seamless switching between dev and production. So if you have a platform for your development purpose, if you like to switch it to production, you can, or you can replicate it to make it as a production. And they also perform automatic daily backups, but I believe that you can configure the backups according to your needs as well. So on the screenshot is just some of the plans, but these plans are subject to change as Azure is a very evolving platform at the moment. As computing needs are changing, they change as well. So it's best to always log into the portal to see what the new plans are, or you can always use your Microsoft Azure calculator to see what works best for you in terms of costing. Implementation considerations here. So budget will be allocated, including time and dollars. Is the bandwidth adequate for you? Because you might select a gateway, let's say if you're using the VPN services and you say I might need 100 gig, but then the actual requirements are 200. This is where you can have a disruption in the services, or you need to adequately calculate what the right bandwidth is. And you can use that to you can calculate using a lot of different tools available, especially when you deal up with the outbound traffic. Is sometimes get quite challenging, that how to estimate that bandwidth. You can also consider the application licensing. Are they transferable, or they support the cloud services? Because a lot of services and softwares might not be still Azure supported, or the license are not transferable. So this is something to be considered. I've also explained this in the case study that your router needs to be Azure supported, because if your router is not Azure supported, you will not be able to establish a VPN connection. Only Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 and higher can run in Azure VMs. There are tricks to run the OS are not supported, but it's not again recommended by Microsoft, because if you would need support, if things go wrong, Microsoft would not be able to help you. So it's a good idea to follow the baseline that Microsoft has set up to run servers 2008 R2 and SP1 and over. You should be able to test your deployments 2 weeks before you go live. You may need MS support to deploy in certain locations. So if you do a bit of development work and testing before you go to live, that will be a very good exercise, because if you straight away try to fail over or start using the services, it will be difficult to identify where things are going wrong or have gone wrong. Having the development kind of helps in trying to identify what issues are there and how can they be mitigated. Some of the reasons that you still might need a server is you need centralized workforce. You got large files, high-res images or videos that take a lot of bandwidth. So at times it would be very cumbersome or not very practical to move it up and down from Azure, as it might cost a lot of bandwidth. So if you have a low bandwidth connection, again, that can cause a lot of problems, that you won't be able to move the files, or let's say if you even have a database that is a huge database, to move in the adequate amount of time because your bandwidth won't allow you. These are certainly like restrictions there. Preferred fixed or upfront cost if you have, if the costs are higher. Pursuing hybrid approach for complex server environments. You can always have those hybrid environments, and Azure supports hybrid environment where you can have few servers on your premises and rest everything that is not so much dependent on high bandwidth and it's or a low weight architecture. You can always move to Azure, for instance, your domain controllers, your print server, but anything which is heavy, like your media servers or heavy files, you can always leave them down on your file servers on your premises. That helps you with the cost and also the bandwidth. So what could US 3500 get me in Azure? Let's have a look. So Azure Case Study Cost Summary. So it's a general case study which can help us identify what can we get out of it. So if you select one virtual server, a standard virtual server, two of them, and the A2V2 is the profile name of the Azure virtual machine. So that profile contains 2 cores, 4 gig of RAM, 135 gig of disk space, and that will cost each of them is 0.203 per hour. So given that hours you have about, let's say roughly in a month, about 744 hours. So it's hosting, domain controllers, file archive, your print server, and AD Connect. So AD Connect is a component which helps you with the data sync. So the estimate monthly cost for running those 2 VMs will be about $300. And then obviously if you have your own site and you need to connect your computers to the domain controller, you will need to establish the VPN gateway. So the standard tiers, again, 744 gateway hours, 100 GB of outbound bandwidth, internet included, and it manages secure data transfers between Azure and your own premises. So that costs roughly about $191, rounded off $200. Then you need your storage, which is about just 600 GB of storage. This is mostly the backup storage because you need to back up those domain controllers. You don't need to necessarily worry about the VPN gateway because it just transfers, but you need to worry about your domain controllers, your virtual servers, in case if there is any corruption or in case you have to get some information at point in time, you should be able to restore and get the data out of it. So you need about 600 GB of storage, basic tier, your local redundancy, about, it says, about 100,000 transactions. That will cost you about $61. So if we do a monthly round off, that comes about $554. Annually about 6,648. So if you take that 5,000 grand, then you just end up paying about 1,646. And if you compare the cost with the traditional data center, that might cost quite a lot because you will have to worry about the cooling, you have to worry about the electricity charges and the other maintenance. So in that sense, it works out quite well given the cost. But again, these costs are subject to change as Microsoft always change their VM profile, so that might cost a little bit less as well. It's always a good idea to check the Azure calculator, price calculator. So this example sort of case study shows move a small 2-tier app into Azure. So in this sense, we have one virtual machine, which is an A1 profile, very basic profile, has 1 core, 2 gig of RAM, and 10 GB of disk, runs SQL VM for database, not compatible with Azure SQL, so that's why we're using that VM, because the database is not compatible with the PaaS platform, which is platform as a service. The estimate is $72. You've got the storage, so blob storage. So what blob storage is how Azure defines the storage. So when you look into the Azure portal about the storage, it will refer the storage as a blob storage. It's like a kind of, you can consider the chunk of storage. And the type is LSR, which is your local redundant storage. So you get about 1 terabyte worth of SQL storage based on the VM template. Costs you about $26, about around of $27. And then you got the ADDS service, which is a free tier per user MFA billing model. So 0 MFA users here, but you can get about 25,000 to 100,000 directory objects. So your AD, which is your Azure Active Directory model, it can store about 100,000 objects in it, giving your users, your groups, and it's an Azure Domain Services, the Azure Identity Management for users to log in with the Office 365 credentials. So previously, if you remember, I mentioned that if you have an Azure account that can also work with your Office 365 tenant as well, they're kind of linked together. And then you have another virtual machine, which is one virtual machine. You use it for about 744 hours. The profile is A2 version 2, uses 2 cores, 4 gig of memory, and 20 GB of hard drive space. The purpose is to use RDP VMs or remote desktop services. You can use up to 1 to 4 users. For application access, costs you about $150. So the monthly cost comes about $391. Your annual cost is about $4,700. If you apply the 5,000 grant, you basically end up paying 0 cost here. So it kind of works out in that scenario very well. So if you have to move a 2-tier app into the Azure Plus, you have an Azure SQL. So you will have the service type, your Azure SQL service, single database, standard tier, S0 level, 10 GTUs, 250 GB worth of storage per DB, and that's your Azure PaaS database. Costs you about $21 a month. Then you have your Azure Domain Services. It's a free tier again. Get the MFA billing model, but obviously got 0 users in that one. Gives you about 100,000 directory objects, and you can use that for about $142 that manages your identity. Again, you don't need to create those standard VMs for your domain services. And you have your VM here, standard VM with the A2 profile, 744 hours, 16 gig of RAM, used for your RDP VMs, about 5 to 10 users for application access. Comes down to monthly about $419 and annual total about $5,028. Again, if you put the grant, you only pay $28, roughly $30, which is pretty good amount. So backup and replication. So backup cost based on number of servers plus storage costs you about 0.03 per GB. On the link, you might be able to find further information about the backup. So it also depends on the backup tier you select. It provides different backup options depending on your VMs, on your PaaS services, and you have the site recovery option, which is about $31.85 per month. Plus there's a VM storage at 0.10 cents per gig, and you can again find further information on the link there. It also provides a lot of flexibility in how often you want to back up your servers, and it gives you the options of if you want to test your disaster recovery as well. So again, there are costs involved in that as well, and I'm sure you can find it on the links there. What sort of costs are involved with the DR testing, and how your storage will increase. So it also works in a sense that the more you use, it kind of reduces at a certain point. So for instance, if it's 10 cents per GB, but if you start to use after 200, 300 gig, it might reduce the cost of the storage. But if you use a local redundancy or a geo redundancy storage, the cost will differ in that sense, because the global redundancy costs a little bit more than local redundancy storage. So where to next? Research the part of Azure that might be relevant to you. Talk to your software vendors about support for hosting their application as Azure. You can sign up for a free trial and visit the Azure marketplace. They got a lot of appliances, security appliances, network appliances, a lot of appliances for developers that might give you how Azure really works and how it integrates with a lot of different applications. You can sign up for your nonprofit Office 365 and Azure Grant, and you can explore how they integrate together, how they work. Given the Azure website, I mean, you can just Google Azure and it will take you there anyway. There are a lot of technical documentations. It will give you the sign up free trial. You can contact the sales. There's a link for price calculator as well. And again, you're going to Google it. It will give you straight away price calculator as well. Just write Azure price calculator and it should come up straight away.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Fahim.
Thank you.
Tina, we might throw back to you for questions.
Great. Thanks, Fahim. Thanks, Marcus. We do have a question that has come through. Craig has asked, is Azure AD Domain Services a replacement for on-prem AD?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the answer depends on the needs and the requirements. You can have it as a replacement, but again, you won't have features like group policy, and you won't be able to manage your own sort of DNS the way you want to manage. And a lot of the parts of the existing domain infrastructure won't be part of it. So the Azure domain services are more like identity management services. So if you have the users who would just like to use the basic applications, for instance, the Microsoft Suite, emails, SharePoint, and there's not much of third-party apps, then Azure Directory Domain Services are a better option because there's less management involved and there's less cost factor. But again, once it starts to get complicated, as if you have third-party apps that integrate with your domain services, a lot of single sign-on services that require custom configuration, or you have databases, or you have applications that heavily depends on your DNS, then it can be a bit difficult for you to do the transition from your existing domain controller services to the Azure domain services. Again, if you don't have those requirements and you have let's say a very few users that just want to use those software services and most like some of PaaS services, then Azure Active Directory services are a better option.
And that's where my simple answer is, if you're a small and simple organization, you could well consider that as a viable option. And we've got many clients that have done that. If you're a large or complex organization, the general rule of thumb is it's not appropriate. It doesn't give you the level of management control or options that you require to manage your infrastructure effectively. Anything else, Tina?
Yes, we've got Christian who's asked, can you please provide information regarding the grant and if it covers backups?
Yes, it can cover backups. The grant has to be applied. Basically, you cover that in the very first slide. So if you miss that, Tina will make the slides available, or you can watch the webinar. But effectively, if you're Microsoft qualified as a charity, you will get the grant for $3,500 US. You then just need to jump on the Connecting Up website, get the token from the account page, as I mentioned at the start, get the token, and then apply that to the Azure portal, so you can then get up to $3,500 US. So yes, it covers backups, and you can run the slide on page whatever it was. I can't go back there. Certainly talked about the backup services, and we've got clients that have backup used in Azure, fully funded by the grant.
Great. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So was there anything that you wanted to add, Marcus and Fahim, before I finish off?
No, just my main comment is it's a really useful tool in your kit bag to deploy cost-effective, valuable infrastructure for your organisation. It's not right for every non-profit, but it is right for a large proportion of them at a time when you're thinking about either replacing your infrastructure or making it more resilient into the future. So our recommendation is every organisation needs to think about Azure and is it right for them, and how can it complement what they have or even replace some of their on-premise environment. So spend the time, get comfortable with it. The grant's available if you're a qualified Microsoft non-profit, i.e. you get the non-profit 365. So it's well worth jumping on and getting familiar with, or getting some advice if you're not sure how to make the most of it. Thanks very much, Tina.
Thanks very much, Marcus and Fahim, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've all learned a lot from this presentation and that all of your questions have been answered. If you do have any other questions that come to mind later on, or any feedback about the webinar, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we'll answer those questions offline. Don't forget that the recording will be available on our website very shortly, and a link will be sent to you, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks, Marcus. Thanks, Fahim.
Thank you.
Thank you.